Now, in many ways, the golden calf story is a classic fall story. And if we've read much biblical theology, we'll know this is like the kind of fall of Israel in many ways, analogous to the fall in the garden. And the stories run in parallel to each other, that God makes a covenant with his people, complete with blessings, instructions, and warnings. He does that in many ways in the garden, and he does it here with Israel just up the mountain, as we heard over the yesterday evening in particular from JD and Ligon. And then temptation comes to God's people in the form of an animal. In the garden, it's a serpent, and here it's a golden calf. It's a calf, an animal, a beast. There's a bestial temptation in both stories. And then there is a counterfeit covenant meal which is offered, as if it's meant to be worshipful to God, but we know it isn't. It's actually a sign of sellout, compromise, idolatry. And the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil replaces the fruit of life. This sitting down to eat and drink and rising up to play replaces the covenant meal that Lig talked us through last night, that they should have been eating that kind of a meal, and instead they're eating this one. Both times I'm taking and eating something I shouldn't be instead of the meal God wanted me to have, which brings life. Then, after that, on being challenged, the representative human who's responsible for guarding the people, whether it be the garden or the sanctuary, Adam and Aaron, they both blame the other people. In Adam's case, he said, well, it was the woman you gave me. And in Aaron's case, he said, I just chucked it in the fire and the calf came out. What do you want me to do? The people then face the consequences of their sin in judgment. And interestingly, the first real-world consequence you can see in both stories, in Genesis 3:4 and in Exodus 32, is fratricide. It leads brothers to kill each other. Now, obviously, the two stories are different because Cain is killing Abel, not because God has commissioned him to or anything, but actually this sense that when you lose relationship with God, brothers start killing each other is a theme that comes often in Scripture, and the idea of brotherly strife as a result of sin is obviously a massive theme in the book of Genesis, in Adam, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, so on. And then finally, we hear in these stories a prayer or a promise in both stories that God will save his people from their sins and crush the bestial source of temptation in the end. Of course, in the case of the garden, the crushing of the serpent is going to wait a long while. But the golden calf doesn't even make it to the end of the chapter before it gets crushed and ground to powder as the bestial source of temptation that it is. Scripture's great, isn't it? The way these stories often reinforce one another and help you see, this is that's about this. And fall stories like that are an all too familiar part of the biblical story, aren't they? We regularly see, I thought we were there. I thought this was going to be the moment it's settled and God established rule and no more strife and suffering, and then another fall. And we have loads of them. You think that the covenant God has made will resolve the problem of human sinfulness once and for all, and then Noah gets drunk. And then David murders Uriah and steals his wife. And then Peter denies Jesus and runs away. Immediately after covenants are sealed or demonstrated in Scripture, you so often get a fall that says this ultimately, more is still needed here. God is going to do something bigger and deeper than that in order to resolve what's happened here. And the same is true, of course, in this story. They're having heard this glorious covenant revealed on the mountain, and they've been invited up to feast in God's presence and behold the throne and see up what's underneath his feet and eat and drink in front of him. And even after that, no, there's a fall. There's a fall, there's judgment, there's justice. Having said that, for a chapter that revolves around judgment as much as this one does, like failure and judgment everywhere, idolatrous sacrifices, broken tablets, a Levitical massacre, a blotting out of books, and then a plague. That's what the story's about. But given all of that, there is actually an awful lot of hope in the wilderness, which is obviously our theme for the conference. There is a lot of hope in this story, and I want us to see it because in and around the judgment and the failure, which is the lives we lead, the things we are surrounded by so much of our time, we see in and through those terrible, bleak, awful, rebellious, idolatrous, judgment-filled moments, wow, look at the hope that God is bringing. And the way I want to do that as we look at it is first of all to consider the bad news, and then to consider the good news, and then to consider the best news as we walk through the text and see the different dynamics of hope that God brings. There is bad news here, no doubt. There is good news, and then there's the best news at the end. But I want to start from the bad news. And the bad news, this is not the bad news that most of us would expect, I suppose, but the bad news in this story is that you become like what you worship. You become like what you worship. We shape our idols, and then our idols shape us, as Winston Churchill might have said. I think he said it about buildings. In fact, he wouldn't have said it like that. He would have said it like, we shape our idols, and then afterwards, our idols shape us, or words to that effect. But that's the dynamic in this story. You build an idol, and then the idol builds you. You fashion something to serve, and then you find yourself serving it. And obviously that principle is explicitly taught in the Bible. We know that. One example of many, Psalm 115, verse 4, their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. Those who make them become like them, and so do all who trust in them. So we know that's a thing. We know that's the way Scripture talks about idolatry and what happens to you when you make an idol. But I don't think it's illustrated anywhere as tragically and definitively as it is here. Israel makes an idol out of earrings. This is an earring god they've built, verses 2 and 3. Superficially impressive, sparkly, but utterly unable to hear or see or speak or act or do anything. And they quickly become just like that. Immediately as Israel has made a god out of earrings, Israel has also become superficially impressive, but unable to see, speak, act, or do anything. Israel becomes unresponsive. No, almost as soon as she's made the golden calf, Israel and even Aaron actually become unresponsive, forgetful, shining on the outside, dead on the inside. You can see it happen in the text. Israel becomes bestial, like a big animal, like a big sort of silent, mute, unable to reason, unthinking beast. Verse 7 says, it's like Israel is only able to sit, stand up, eat, drink, play. It's like Israel's just sitting there like a giant cow. Do you see the way it's picturing Israel is as if to help us see, you've become like what you worship. You've worshipped a calf, and now you've become a kind of being you just sit, eat, drink, stand up, play a bit, go back, sit, eat. You're like a cow. You've turned into the thing you made. And if you make a god in your image, you very quickly become more and more like that thing. It's a terrifying judgment. And then in verse 9, we have the kicker, which is that God speaks of Israel and says, Israel is a stiff-necked people. They built a golden calf with a stiff neck and a hard heart, and they've become a people with a stiff neck and a hard heart. They've become like what they worship. And so do you, and so do I. And that's bad news for every idolater. In fact, Aaron has become so passive that he's lost all agency and genuinely thinks, I know it's a kind of comedy excuse when he says, I chucked it in the fire. I read it and you all laughed. I threw it in the fire and out comes the calf. It's such a terrible excuse. But I think it's intended to teach us not just a bad excuse, but that Aaron has become passive to the point that he almost believes it. I don't know, I just chucked it in, this thing happened. I've lost my agency. I've lost the thing. I'm supposed to be leading the people, but I've turned into sort of passive object of the desires of other people, just like the golden calf. So Aaron the priest and Israel the nation make the calf, and then they kind of turn into it. Oh, brothers and sisters, it's so disturbing how idols do that. They make you more like themselves. As you stare at them, as you honor them, as you venerate them, as you think, that's the good life, this is what I want, you turn into that thing. It's frightening. And it's not just true in Scripture, it's true now. I don't know if you've read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. I hadn't read it. I know some of us read it in school. In Britain, we don't really, but it's a story set in sort of the ivory trade in the Belgian Congo, and famously now, there's sort of the same story as Apocalypse Now. And so if you've seen Apocalypse Now, you know how Marlon Brando looks at the end of Apocalypse Now, completely sort of white, bald head, just going, the horror, The horror. The reason he does is because what Conrad does in his novel, which the film is based on, is to tell the story about how people are so rapacious and desperate for ivory that they will do terrible, terrible, unspeakable things to the Congolese and others in Central Africa. And what happens as they do, Conrad has this amazing description of Kurtz, the Marlon Brando guy, at the end of the novel, where he describes him as sort of white, shiny head, almost completely like ivory. That these people have given themselves so much to the pursuit of ivory, to killing elephants, to getting more and more of it so they can make more and more money. Their greed has overtaken them so much, and they've idolized ivory so much that they actually look like a tusk. They look like they're made of ivory. Their heads are almost like polished white. And so if you watch Apocalypse Now, and many of us won't want to, but if you do, and you see that, you think, that's a statement of the fact that those who worship idols become like them. If you obsess over ivory your life, you end up turning into it, is what Conrad is cleverly doing with that story. And it happens in all sorts of situations, like Eustace turning into a dragon. Might be a more familiar example to many of us in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. But exactly the same thing happens. I'm obsessing over gold. I'm thinking, I would like the amount of stuff and loot that this dragon has, and then he becomes what he worships. You see it everywhere. For a contemporary example, consider how our generation is becoming like these. How much you become like what you serve. You and I, our generation, assimilate vast amounts of information at breakneck speed. And we move incredibly quickly. And we can be everywhere at once, and yet somehow also nowhere at once. We become increasingly disembodied. We become incapable of sustained attention, just like this does. We have multiple dozens of apps open in our heads at once, which means it's very difficult for us to be here without thinking about that as well and wondering, is there another app that's burning up energy in the background here? We have experienced a lack of work-play boundaries. We have a lack of focus on the person in front of us because there's lots of other things running at the same time. We're continually distracted, restlessly anxious, very efficient, and yet a lot smaller than we used to be. We become like what we worship. It's terrifying for idolaters. We shape our idols, and thereafter, they shape us. We become like what we worship. That's the bad news. But the good news is, we become like what we worship. It's wonderful. We become like what we worship. If instead of worshiping the golden calf and becoming bestial, only able to eat and drink and rise and play, and hard-hearted and stiff-necked, but if instead of doing that, we worship the God of Israel, the God of the burning bush, the I am, Yahweh, Jehovah. If we, instead of worshiping the cow, worship the real God, if instead of worshiping the earring God, we worship the hearing God, we become like him instead. And that's what happens to Moses in this passage. It's so beautiful. He spent 40 days on the mountain in the presence of the real God, the Lord, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. There's Exodus 34, verse 6. He hasn't quite had that name revealed yet, but he will, and we're okay jumping in the script, I trust. There's no spoilers here. But Moses has spent 40 days in his presence. And we've heard next to nothing about Moses in the last 7 or 8 chapters. But we can see in this passage that his time on the mountain in the presence of God has really done him the power of good. He's become like who he worships. Moses has become, not in a perfect way, but in a very profound way, he has become merciful and gracious and slow to anger and abounding in love and faithfulness to some degree, yet he still doesn't leave the guilty unpunished. And that comes through the story in a whole bunch of different ways, which the writer wants us to see. I'm trying to persuade you of that. So when the Lord first talks about what Israel has done, it says his wrath burns hot in verse 10. So look at verse 10, his wrath burns hot. Then when Moses sees what the people have done, obviously the Lord knows it before Moses does. So the Lord sees it, his wrath burns hot. Moses sees it, verse 19, his wrath burns hot. Exactly the same phrase. When Aaron sees Moses, he says, let the wrath of my Lord burn hot, as in, I know you're mad, but please hear me out. In other words, God's reaction to the sin and Moses' reaction to the sin are identical to the extent that Aaron can tell that Moses has reacted just like God. The writer's doing that on purpose so that we can see it. If you spend time in the presence of God, your attitude to the sin and idolatry that surrounds you becomes analogous to, of a piece with, the reaction that God has to sin and idolatry. And that's great, because you are becoming like the one you worship.